Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take a huge stack of research, articles, all sorts of sources, and basically boil it down to the essential intelligence you need, without all the jargon and filler. And today, our mission, well, it's arguably one of the most critical we've tackled. It's a real deep dive into modern systemic security. We're looking at everything, threats against critical infrastructure like physical sabotage, right down to the tiny mathematical details, the cryptography that keeps our data safe or exposes it. We're pulling out the most crucial, sometimes surprising insights about this super connected digital world we all live in now. Yeah, the big theme, really, across all our sources is this new interconnected threat. Our daily lives, they aren't just held by digital systems anymore. We're completely dependent on them. It's way beyond just patching a server. Our sources point out that, everyday things, consumer smart appliances, your fridge maybe checking if you need milk, or your washing machine sending status updates over Wi-Fi. All of this is getting woven into this massive digital fabric.
And that fabric, well, it represents an exponentially growing risk surface, a really valuable one. When you bring these devices into your home network and connect them to the wider grid, you're constantly generating incredibly detailed data.
What sort of data are we talking about?
We're talking really granular patterns, energy use, minute by minute, living habits, when you're home, when you're not. Even things like purchasing trends or dietary habits can be inferred. And this information, it's a prime target. It's not just malicious hackers wanting to clone the damage.
Right.
It's also sophisticated data brokers, companies looking to use it for hyper-specific consumer pricing, targeted ads, maybe even regulatory profiling down the line. The convenience is there, absolutely, but the potential for data leakage is just enormous.
Okay, let's start then with the biggest potential societal risk. Critical infrastructure, specifically the smart grid. The sources we looked at define this as a huge technological shift, right? A new era meant to boost resilience, performance, efficiency across the whole power industry, from the power plant right to your light switch.
Exactly. The goal is laudable. Better monitoring, quicker fault response, overall efficiency gains. But here's the paradox. The very systems that make the grid more valuable and, theoretically, more resilient also expose it to digital threats that just, well, they didn't exist in the old analog grid.
Okay.
We're talking about threats ranging from, large-scale data theft and simple privacy invasion right up to coordinated kinetic sabotage of vital national infrastructure.
Right.
Physical damage caused by digital means.
And it's getting more complex all the time, isn't it? Because the grid itself is changing. We can't just talk about the old model of centralized power plants and transmission lines, the T&D.
No, you really can't. The modern grid includes much more complex generation architectures, especially with the boom in distributed generation.
Distributed generation? You mean like solar farms, wind turbines?
Yes, but it goes much further down. It's also residential batteries, rooftop solar panels on houses, even large fleets of electric vehicles that can potentially feed power back into the grid. This micro-integration adds layers of complexity. Well, these smaller, numerous power sources, which used to be kind of isolated, are now mixing their operational risks and their control systems directly into the main smart grid infrastructure. And often they rely on, frankly, consumer-grade internet connectivity for coordination and control. That introduces a whole new set of vulnerabilities.
So if an attacker manages to get inside that complex system, the prize is pretty big. Our sources really emphasize that compromising a T-SCADA server, that's transmission SCADA, or an energy management system, an EMS server, basically gives an attacker the ultimate command and control over the physical transmission process. That sounds bad. What does ultimate control actually let them do?
It lets them orchestrate a simultaneous coordinated failure. Think of that SCADA or EMS server as the operational brain of the transmission system. If you compromise the brain, you can fundamentally alter both what it senses, its inputs, and what it does, its outputs.
Okay, so how does that work with inputs?
With inputs, they can spoof the monitored data. Things like phasor measurements that show grid stability, line voltages, fault reports coming in from sensors. All of it can be faked. So the operator sitting in the control room might be looking at a screen that says a transmission line is perfectly fine, normal voltage, normal frequency.
While in reality,
that physical line is dangerously overloading or experiencing a critical fault, you're deliberately making the operators blind to a developing physical crisis. You essentially create instability, and then you hide it from the people who could stop it.
Wow. Okay, and the outputs, what can they actively manipulate?
That's where the direct sabotage comes in. They gain control over capacitance adjustments, which affect voltage stability. They can trigger load shedding, basically cutting power to areas And critically, they can manipulate protection systems and circuit breaker controls.
So they could, what, just open breakers?
Exactly. An attacker could force critical circuit breakers open, potentially starting a cascading blackout across a region, while simultaneously feeding false nominal status back to the EMS server. The result is a real-world physical breakdown engineered entirely through digital deception.
Now, what's really striking is that our sources suggest an attacker doesn't necessarily need some, super expensive, top secret zero-day vulnerability to do this. There are inherent weaknesses, design flaws in the industrial protocols themselves.
That's often where the low-hanging fruit lies, yes.
These industrial protocols, Modbus, DNP3, IEC 61850, they were often designed decades ago for efficiency and simplicity, operating under the assumption they'd be in physically secure, air-gapped networks. Security wasn't the primary design goal.
And that lack of built-in security creates openings.
Big ones. Many of these protocols have incredibly powerful yet fundamentally insecure native commands built right in. For example, some protocol commands allow broadcasting a single message simultaneously to hundreds, maybe thousands, of field devices at once. Okay, I can see where that's going.
Right. An attacker can leverage that for a massive denial of service, a DOS attack, just by flooding every device on a substation network with legitimate but overwhelming requests. Other commands are designed simply to query the network for defined points and values, essentially asking each device, what are you monitoring? That's a powerful configuration scan that maps the entire system for the attacker for free.
And there are others.
Oh, yeah. Some commands literally list all the available function codes a device supports. This gives the attacker a complete feature map of what the device can do. It's called a function scan. It's like handing them the instruction manual.
So the very features designed to make the system manageable and, well, helpful can be turned into weapons.
Precisely. And because of this, network-based attacks become highly feasible just by injecting malicious but correctly formatted protocol commands into the network traffic. You mentioned not needing a zero-day, and that brings up bit flipping.
Bit flipping.
Yeah. If an attacker can get onto the network and intercept legitimate protocol traffic, maybe between the control center and a substation, they often don't need to craft a whole new malicious message. They can just alter a single bit or a few bits in a legitimate message in transit.
Like changing.
Like changing a status flag from normal to alarm, or changing a close breaker command to an open breaker command, or altering the target voltage setting in a control message. The receiving device, seeing a correctly formatted message, just executes the altered, now malicious command as if it were legitimate.
That tiny change, one bit, can trigger a physical action. Okay, before we move off the grid, we should circle back to the user level. What about the data from smart meters, the advanced metering infrastructure, AMI data?
Right. AMI is a huge privacy concern. This isn't just about total monthly usage anymore. AMI data includes extremely granular customer usage profiles, how much energy you use literally minute by minute when you use it. It also includes billing information, potentially personal identifying information.
And that level of detail is risky.
Hugely. It can strongly suggest when a home is unoccupied, making it a target for burglars. It can reveal when specific high-draw appliances are running, giving insights into lifestyle or even medical equipment usage. If this data gets intercepted during communication back to the utility's control room, or if the utility's database is breached, it becomes a goldmine for targeted crime, industrial espionage against businesses, or just invasive profiling and predictive modeling by data brokers.
Okay, so the infrastructure itself is vulnerable, from the protocols right down to the customer data. Let's shift focus now to the attackers themselves and their tools. When we look at really sophisticated attacks, the kind attributed to nation-states, things like Stuxnet, Flame, Gas,
Yeah.
what's the defining characteristic of this advanced, persistent malware?
I'd say the single common theme running through all of them is sophisticated mutability and adaptability. This kind of malware isn't built for a quick smash and grab. It's designed for persistence. It's meant to stay hidden, sometimes operating silently inside a target network for months, even years.
So it needs to hide, but also evolve.
Exactly. It has to conceal itself effectively from defenses. It needs mechanisms to update its own functionality over time, maybe downloading new modules. It must be able to propagate across different types of systems and network architectures within the target environment. And crucially, it has to adapt to changes, new security patches deployed by the defenders, changes in network configuration. It's built to survive.
And that persistence isn't just about staying hidden, is it? It serves a purpose.
Absolutely. Persistence is the foundation for prolonged, deep espionage. An attacker might spend, say, 6 months, maybe longer, just quietly mapping the network, stealing documents about national grid infrastructure, trying to understand energy generation patterns, figuring out outage response procedures, cataloging internal communication protocols,
Yeah.
building a complete picture.
And once they have that picture, that foothold,
Right, that persistence then acts as a launching point. It's like having a sleeper agent already inside the target's fortress. That agent can then be activated, perhaps receiving a signal or a brand new functionality update from a remote command and control server, a CNC framework. This update could instantly give the malware instructions to pivot from passive espionage to active sabotage using all the knowledge it gathered.
the level of stealth involved is just incredible. Let's use Stuxnet as a classic case study here for evasion techniques. You mentioned it hid its code in memory, not in the usual file locations. Why was that such a game changer back then?
It really was. It exploited a fundamental assumption that most antivirus AV software made at the time. See, conventional malware, historically, would often store its malicious payload, its executable code, in fairly predictable places on the file system. Often, common Windows functions like opening files, reading data rely on these shared libraries called dynamic link libraries, or DLLs. A typical hacker might try to hide their malicious code inside a legitimate DLL, or maybe plant a malicious file disguised as something harmless. AV scanners were pretty good at scanning these files for known malware signatures or suspicious code patterns.
But Stuxnet didn't do that.
No, Stuxnet used a combination of zero-day exploits vulnerabilities unknown to Microsoft or defenders to bypass normal system protections. Then, instead of writing its core malicious code to a file on the hard disk, it injected it directly into the machine's volatile memory, the system RAM. This was critical because, back in 2010, many AV scanners were heavily focused on scanning the file system. Files are persistent, easier to analyze.
Memory is temporary.
Exactly. Memory is ephemeral. By residing almost entirely in memory, Stuxnet was much harder to find and fingerprint using traditional methods. And it didn't stop there. It used a highly complex sequence of operations involving things like hooking system functions and manipulating process memory to actually get that memory-resident code to run, often without ever writing a recognizable malicious file to the disk that AV could easily flag. That jump from disk-based malware to sophisticated memory-resident malware was a huge leap in evasion tactics.
Which brings us, unfortunately, to the real-world impact. This isn't just theoretical or just about stealing data. These tools can cause actual physical destruction. We have clear examples.
Oh, absolutely. The 2012 Wiper attack against the Iranian oil ministry is a stark example of pure, unadulterated sabotage. The malware wasn't designed to steal data or demand ransom. Its sole purpose was to systematically destroy information documents, critical data files, even core operating system files needed to boot the machine. It culminated in systematically crashing hard drives across the ministry. The goal was simply erasure, causing massive operational disruption and permanent data loss.
And we saw a more developed multi-stage version of this destructive approach used extensively in Ukraine, didn't we?
Yes, Ukraine really became a proving ground, particularly with the combination of the black energy malware and the kill disk wiper component. The attack sequence was methodical and highly effective.
How did it work?
Black energy often served as the initial access tool. It was used for reconnaissance, mapping the target network, identifying critical servers or workstations, establishing that crucial persistence we talked about. Once the attackers had a good map and solid footing within the network.
Then they deployed kill disk.
Right. They unleashed kill disk. And kill disk was brutal. It caused massive operational paralysis. We saw it used against a Ukrainian media company where it reportedly wiped over 100 computers, effectively shutting them down. More critically, it was aimed at major infrastructure targets, including Ukraine's national railway company and Kyiv's main Boryspil International Airport. The malware was specifically crafted to make systems unbootable, often by overwriting the master boot record, MBR, on the hard drive, essentially bricking the machines.
That's crippling disruption. But then came the NotPetya ransomware incident, which took things to another level, showing how digital destruction translates directly into, well, human catastrophe.
NotPetya was something else. While it initially masqueraded as ransomware demanding Bitcoin payment, security researchers quickly concluded its primary function was destructive. It was fundamentally a wiper attack, cleverly disguised. It spread incredibly rapidly, first across Ukraine, hitting banks, government ministries, power companies, airports, hospitals, and then it spilled out globally, causing billions in damages.
What were the impacts on the ground, especially in places like hospitals?
The consequences were immediate and devastating and deeply personal. In Ukrainian hospitals, sources reported that virtually all Windows-based machines were hit, encrypted, and rendered useless at the system level. This wasn't just about losing access to spreadsheets or emails.
You know,
It meant critical systems went down. Scheduling systems for patient appointments were wiped out, forcing cancellations for potentially urgent procedures. Reports indicated that GPS systems used to dispatch and track ambulances failed, leading to critical delays in emergency response times. And because the encryption or wiping was so thorough, even if hospitals had backups, those backups were often several days old. This meant any medical tests conducted in the intervening days, blood work, scans like MRIs, X-rays, the data was gone. It all had to be invalidated and redone from scratch. It's a terrifying illustration of how the failure of purely digital systems can have immediate, irreversible, and devastating human consequences.
it really underscores the stakes. Okay, if that's the level of threat we're facing, the defenses absolutely have to be robust, mathematically sound. Let's talk about the core foundations of digital security, starting with cryptography. This seems like an area where fundamental choices, often made quietly by organizations, can either secure millions of users or leave them exposed.
Cryptography is absolutely the bedrock. You can broadly divide it into two main camps: symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric algorithms are the workhorses. They use the same single key for both encryption and decryption. They're generally very fast and efficient.
Like DES.
Right. The data encryption standard, DES, is a classic example of a symmetric block cipher. It was ubiquitous for decades. But DES also perfectly illustrates the main historical weakness of symmetric methods: key length. DES used a 56-bit key.
And 56 bits isn't enough anymore.
Not even close. With today's computing power, especially using parallel processing or distributed computing clusters, a 56-bit key can be brute forced, meaning trying every possible key in potentially hours, minutes, maybe even seconds in some scenarios. It's completely inadequate for protecting anything sensitive today. You really need key lengths of 128 bits, or preferably 256 bits, like with AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, for strong symmetric security now.
Okay, so symmetric keys need to be long. That brings us to the other camp, public key, or asymmetric cryptography. This seems indispensable for large-scale security, right? Powering things like secure websites, HTTPS TLS, encrypted email, digital signatures. It uses two keys.
That's right. Asymmetric crypto solves the key distribution problem inherent in symmetric systems. Instead of sharing one secret key, you generate a mathematically linked pair of keys: a public key and a private key.
How does that work?
You can distribute your public key freely, post it on your website, email it to contacts. Anyone can use your public key to encrypt a message that only you can decrypt using your corresponding private key, which you keep absolutely secret. Or you can use your private key to create a digital signature on a message, which anyone can then verify using your public key, proving the message came from you and wasn't tampered with. This public-private key concept is fundamental to secure communication on the internet, underpinning protocols like TLS, SSL, and it's used for secure key exchange mechanisms like Diffie-Hellman.
Let's dive into the math behind the most famous public key system, RSA. It's been the standard for decades. Its security relies on a specific mathematical problem being really, really hard to solve, correct?
Correct. RSA security is based entirely on the difficulty of the integer factorization problem. When you generate an RSA key pair, you start by finding two extremely large distinct prime numbers, let's call them P or 20. You multiply them together to get a very large number, non-dollar, which is the modulus and part of your public key.
And breaking RSA means?
Breaking RSA essentially means taking that public number $D and figuring out the original prime factors, PS and dollars. For the key sizes used today, factoring $9 is computationally infeasible with current technology and known algorithms. It would take potentially thousands of years on the fastest supercomputers. You also calculate another value, a phi n, which is a P1 $2-1, needed for the key generation math, but the core security rests on factoring non-dollars.
And the key size is critical here. The sources mentioned the jump from 1024-bit keys to 2048-bit keys. How much harder does that make factoring?
It makes it exponentially harder. That's the key takeaway. The difficulty doesn't scale linearly, it scales much faster. Our sources highlight that factoring a 2048-bit RSA number requires something on the order of two basic computational operations. Now compare that to the older 1024-bit keys, which are now considered breakable by well-funded adversaries. Factoring the 2048-bit key is roughly a million times slower computationally. That massive exponential increase in difficulty is why organizations were forced to move from 1024 bits to 2048, and why many standards bodies now recommend 3072 or even 4096-bit RSA keys for long-term security. The sheer size of the key provides the security margin against improving factoring algorithms and faster computers.
Okay, so if 2048-bit RSA is a million times harder to break than 1024, and 3072 or 496 are even stronger, why are we seeing this huge global push, especially in new standards and mobile devices, toward elliptic curve cryptography, or ECC? If RSA still works and is mathematically sound with large enough keys, why switch? Why introduce the complexity of a whole different system?
That is the absolute core of the modern security shift, especially for mobile and the web. You're right, RSA with large keys is mathematically sound today, but its reliance on ever larger keys creates a significant performance and overhead problem.
How so?
Think about the devices we use constantly. Smartphones, tablets, IoT sensors, smartwatches. These are resource-constrained devices. They have limited processing power, limited battery life. Performing cryptographic operations, especially the key generation or the private key operations like signing, with a 3072-bit or 496-bit RSA key is computationally expensive. It takes time, it consumes processing cycles, and it drains battery. The same applies to busy web servers handling thousands of TLS connections per second. RSA becomes a bottleneck.
And ECC solves this.
ECC offers a remarkable solution. It provides the same level of cryptographic security as RSA, but with dramatically smaller key sizes. For example, a 256-bit ECC key is generally considered to offer equivalent security strength to a 3072-bit RSA key. A 384-bit ECC key is comparable to a massive 7680-bit RSA key.
Wow, that's a huge difference. 256 bits versus 372.
It's enormous, and this massive reduction in key size translates directly into vastly improved performance. Generating ECC keys is faster. Performing ECC signatures or verifications is much faster. The key exchange part of setting up a secure connection, like in TLS, is significantly quicker. This means less computational load, lower latency, and critically for mobile devices, significantly lower battery consumption and faster secure operations. ECC is essentially tailor-made for the performance requirements and resource constraints of modern computing, especially mobile phones, IoT devices, and high-traffic web servers. That efficiency is why it's rapidly replacing RSA in new standards and applications.
That efficiency gain is compelling. Okay, let's get into the math a bit. If RSA relies on the difficulty of factoring large primes, what's the underlying hard mathematical problem that secures ECC?
ECC is built on a different area of mathematics, specifically the difficulty of the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, ECDLP. It works with points on a mathematical curve defined by a specific equation. The core operations in ECC are point addition, adding 2 points on the curve to get a third point on the curve, and point multiplication.
Point multiplication, is that just repeated addition?
Essentially, yes. Point multiplication involves adding a single point on the curve to itself a large number of times. So if you have a starting point, Paulo, the base point, which is public, and a large secret integer, to call your private key, you compute 1q, times p by repeatedly adding polar to itself time polar. Q becomes your public key.
Okay, so calculating q from k and p is easy.
Relatively easy, yes. Modern algorithms do this efficiently. But the security comes from the reverse operation. If someone knows the public base point, $, and your public key $, it is extremely difficult computationally to figure out the secret integer $, the private key, such that 1 curie ISE times PS. That's the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem. It's believed to be significantly harder bit for bit than the integer factorization problem that RSA relies on.
And these operations, they happen in a special mathematical space.
Right. They don't happen over regular numbers. They are performed over finite fields, often represented using polynomials. This ensures that all the points in calculations stay within a defined, finite mathematical structure, which is essential for cryptographic security and efficiency. The choice of the specific curve and the underlying finite field is also critical for security.
You mentioned efficiency allowing for more advanced techniques. Our sources touch on pairing-based cryptography, often built on ECC. What's a pairing and why is it useful?
Pairings are a more advanced concept. A pairing is essentially a special mathematical function, often denoted as $, that takes 2 input points from an elliptic curve group, or potentially 2 different groups, and maps them to a single element in a third group, often called the target group. The key is that this mapping has a property called bilinearity.
Bilinearity.
But in simple terms, it means the pairing function interacts nicely with the point multiplication we just discussed. For example, EA times P, B times Q, EP, QA times B. This property, while mathematically complex, enables some really powerful cryptographic functionalities that are difficult or impossible with standard RSA or basic ECC.
Like what?
One prominent example is aggregate signatures. Imagine you have multiple people, say another people, who each sign the same message using their individual ECC private keys, creating signatures, $, $, SNH. Using pairings, you can combine all these individual signatures into a single short aggregate signature, $.
And you can verify that single signature.
Yes. Someone can verify that single aggregate signature $, using the public keys of all in dollars, and it confirms that all of them did indeed sign the original message. This is incredibly efficient compared to verifying $separate signatures, especially in systems with many participants, like blockchains, secure logging, or complex authorization workflows. It saves a lot of computation and bandwidth.
So we have these incredibly powerful mathematical tools, RSA, and especially the more efficient ECC. But the sources consistently warn that even mathematically perfect algorithms can be broken if they're implemented poorly.
That is perhaps the most common and dangerous failure mode in real-world cryptography: subtle implementation flaws. You can have a mathematically unbreakable algorithm like AES or ECC, but if the software code that performs the encryption or generates the keys is flawed, it can leak critical information, including the private key itself.
How does that happen? Side channels.
Side channel attacks are a major category here, yes. An attacker might not break the math directly, but instead observes how the cryptographic operation is performed. They might measure the precise time it takes to perform certain calculations, which can vary depending on the secret key bits. Or they monitor the device's power consumption during encryption, or even analyze the faint electromagnetic emissions. These side channels can inadvertently leak information about the secret key. Other flaws can be more direct coding errors, like using a weak random number generator for keys or incorrectly handling padding and block ciphers.
So how do you defend against these subtle implementation bugs?
Rigorous, multifaceted testing is crucial. Code reviews, static analysis tools, fuzz testing. But one particularly effective technique mentioned in the sources is testing different, independently developed implementations of the same algorithm for interoperability.
Making sure they can talk to each other.
Exactly. If you have, say, 3 different software libraries all claiming to implement the same ECC curve and protocols, and you test them rigorously to ensure they can successfully generate keys, encrypt, decrypt, sign, and verify messages with each other, that process tends to shake out a lot of the more subtle implementation errors. If library A made a mistake in coding the point addition formula, it likely won't be able to correctly process keys or signatures generated by library D or C. Interoperability testing builds confidence that the implementations are correct according to the standard. Of course, choosing well-vetted standardized curves like those recommended by NIST or other reputable bodies is also critical to avoid using potentially weakened mathematical foundations.
Okay, moving beyond the core cryptography, effective system defense also relies heavily on fundamental operational principles. If you had to pick just one core principle that prevents the most widespread security failures, what would it be?
Without a doubt, it's the principle of least privilege. It sounds simple, but its impact is profound. This principle states that any user, program, or process should only have the absolute bare minimum permissions privileges necessary to perform its specific authorized tasks, and absolutely nothing more.
And this needs to be applied everywhere.
Everywhere, across every data access attempt, every system action, every user account, every service account, every API call. It needs to be the default mindset.
Why is violating this principle so often linked to mass breaches?
It comes down to limiting the blast radius of a compromise. Attackers are always looking for the path of least resistance that yields the maximum return. If overly broad permissions exist, maybe a temporary intern's account mistakenly has read access to the entire customer database, or a web server process is running with administrator rights when it only needs basic file access, then compromising that one low-level account or process can immediately lead to a catastrophic data breach involving millions of records, or complete system takeover. Least privilege acts as internal containment. It ensures that even if one component is compromised, the damage is limited because that component didn't have permission to access everything else.
Makes sense. Finally, let's loop back quickly to the large-scale attacks we discussed earlier. How do organizations defend their network perimeter against massive, coordinated denial-of-service attacks designed to just overwhelm their capacity?
It really requires a layered defense strategy, defense in depth. The goal is to identify and discard malicious attack traffic as early, as close to the source as possible to protect downstream
What
resources.
are the layers?
Your first line of defense is typically at the network edge, often using edge routers or dedicated DOS mitigation appliances. These can handle the massive, high-bandwidth volumetric attacks, things like UDP floods or ICMP floods, often by using techniques like rate limiting or even BGP blackholing to drop traffic destined for the target IP address before it consumes significant internal bandwidth. The next layer might involve network load balancers or firewalls, which can handle more sophisticated packet flooding attacks, perhaps looking for protocol anomalies or implementing SYN cookies to mitigate SYN floods. Then, further in, application load balancers, or web application firewalls, WAFs, deal with application layer DOS attacks. These might involve fewer packets overall, but are designed to exploit specific resource-intensive functions of an application or API, aiming to exhaust server CPU or memory.
So filtering at multiple points.
Yes, and the key principle is to use tools like access control lists, ACLs, right at the network edge whenever possible. If you can identify patterns of obvious attack traffic early, maybe traffic from known malicious IP addresses or malformed packets, filtering it out immediately conserves your valuable internal bandwidth and the processing power of your more sophisticated and expensive security devices and servers further down the chain. Early mitigation is crucial.
Okay, we've covered a lot of the technical ground, the infrastructure of the attacks, the defenses, but often the weakest links aren't technological, they're human or organizational. High on that list, according to our sources, is supply chain risk. How can something seemingly unrelated, like the company that installs your HVAC system or your physical security cameras, become a systemic cybersecurity risk?
It's all about unintentional integration and, frankly, trust creep. Organizations absolutely rely on third-party specialist companies for installing and maintaining systems that seem peripheral to the core IT mission. Things like building management systems, BMS, fire detection, environmental controls, physical access control systems like badge readers, even network coffee machines these days.
So where's the cyber risk?
It's twofold, mainly. First, the engineers from these third-party companies often need significant network access, sometimes even administrative privileges, to install, configure, commission, and troubleshoot their systems. The problem is, these access credentials or network pathways might not be properly revoked or secured once the job is done, leaving a potential backdoor open. Second, the systems themselves that they install might introduce vulnerabilities. Perhaps the HVAC controller is an insecure IoT device with default passwords. Maybe the physical security system needs to communicate back to the vendor for updates, and they punch a hole through the firewall or bypass network segmentation rules to enable that remote access, creating an unintended attack vector. An attacker who compromises a smaller, potentially less secure third-party vendor could potentially gain backdoor access into the networks of dozens of their larger, more secure corporate clients. You absolutely have to scrutinize and manage the security practices and the network access granted to all third parties, ensuring their engineers aren't inadvertently or intentionally introducing critical vulnerabilities.
And the attackers themselves, they're not just randomly trying things, are they? They operate methodically, using established tactics, techniques, and procedures, DTPs.
Absolutely. Long gone are the days of purely opportunistic hacking for most serious threats. Sophisticated actors operate with discipline. The MITRE ATT and CK framework has become the sort of industry standard language for cataloging and understanding these TTPs. It moves the conversation away from just talking about specific malware names, which change constantly, and focuses instead on the actions attackers take at each stage of an intrusion.
Like reconnaissance, initial access, execution, persistence.
Exactly. It provides defenders with a structured way to think about the entire attack lifecycle, anticipate likely adversary actions, and map their defenses against specific techniques.
Can you give a concrete example of a TTP?
Sure. Let's take the credential access tactic, the stage where attackers try to steal account names and passwords. ATT and CK lists numerous techniques for this. Some are high-tech, like installing keyloggers or dumping password hashes from memory. But one technique it documents is surprisingly simple: reading command history files.
Like your shell history.
Precisely. On a Linux or Mac OS system, a user's command history is often saved in a file like .bash history. An attacker who has gained basic user-level access to that machine might find that the legitimate user accidentally typed their password directly into the command line at some point. Maybe they typed sudo my secret password instead of just sudo command and then entering the password when prompted. The attacker simply reads the .bash history file and finds the password accidentally logged there. It's a perfect example of how a relatively low-tech credential access technique might follow a more sophisticated initial entry exploit.
Once an attacker gets that initial foothold, maybe through phishing or exploiting a vulnerability, the next major goal is almost always privilege escalation, right? Getting higher levels of access. What are the fundamental exploitation techniques used for this?
One of the absolute classic foundational techniques is the buffer overflow vulnerability. It's been around for decades, but still pops up. It happens when a program tries to copy data, often data that comes from an untrusted source like user input or network traffic, into a specific area of memory called a buffer.
But the buffer isn't big enough.
Exactly. The program doesn't properly check the size of the incoming data, and it copies more data than the buffer was allocated to hold. The excess data spills over, or overflows, into adjacent memory locations, overwriting whatever was stored there.
And why is that dangerous?
It's dangerous because what often gets overwritten is critical control information used by the program. Most famously, the overflow might overwrite the return address stored on the program's stack. The return address tells the processor where to continue execution after the current function finishes. If the attacker can carefully craft their overflowing input data to overwrite this return address with the memory address of their own malicious code, which they also injected, perhaps as part of the overflow.
The program jumps to the attacker's code.
Precisely. When the vulnerable function tries to return, instead of going back to the legitimate next instruction, the processor jumps to the attacker's malicious payload. This typically gives the attacker arbitrary code execution, often with the same privileges as the vulnerable application, which might be higher than the privileges they initially had. It's a way to hijack the program's control flow.
And buffer overflows aren't the only way. SQL injection is another oldie but goodie that keeps showing up, especially in web applications.
SQL injection is another classic because it fundamentally exploits the blurring of boundaries between data and executable code. It occurs when a web application, or any application interacting with a database, constructs its SQL query strings by directly concatenating user-supplied input into the query.
So the user input becomes part of the database command.
Yes. If the application doesn't properly sanitize or validate that input, a malicious user can inject snippets of SQL code. A common example is injecting something like OR11 into a username or password field. This might trick the database's logic into always evaluating the condition as true, potentially bypassing authentication or, in other contexts, allowing the attacker to view all records in a table, modify data, or even drop entire tables, depending on how the query was constructed and the database permissions.
Even though we know how to prevent this, using things like prepared statements.
Right. Using prepared statements, or parameterized queries, is the standard, safe way to interact with databases, as it strictly separates the SQL command logic from the user's supplied data. However, flaws still persist. Sometimes the vulnerability isn't in the main web application code itself, but maybe deep inside some back-end reporting tool, or a database stored procedure, or a configuration component that dynamically constructs SQL queries based on user-influenced settings in an unsafe way. Security really is only as strong as the weakest link in the entire data handling chain.
Okay, one final, really thorny issue.
Yeah.
The organizational and almost philosophical challenge around transparency and security disclosure. If an organization discovers a serious vulnerability in its systems, or if a vendor discovers one in their product, what's the right thing to do? It seems like there's a real tension here.
It's a huge dilemma, a critical paradox for the entire security ecosystem. On one hand, transparency seems essential. For privacy regulations, users often have a right to know if their data might have been exposed due to a breach caused by a vulnerability. For fostering trust, openness about flaws seems important.
But the downside?
The downside is significant. Publicly releasing the technical details of a critical vulnerability, or even just releasing the patch that fixes it, can immediately provide adversaries with the exact information they need to develop and exploit and attack systems that haven't been patched yet. You risk enabling copycat attacks on a massive scale.
Yeah.
The very act of disclosing the defense can inadvertently arm the offense.
And we have a perfect, almost textbook historical example of this exact paradox playing out, don't we?
We do. The case of Microsoft's security bulletin MS-05039, released in August 2005, is probably the definitive illustration. Microsoft released this patch to fix a critical plug-and-play vulnerability in Windows 2000. It was a serious flaw.
So they did the right thing, released the patch. What happened next?
What happened next was predictable in retrospect. The global security community, both defenders and attackers, immediately got hold of the patch file. And just 4 days later, the Zertob worm emerged and started spreading rapidly, exploiting that very MS-05039 vulnerability and causing widespread disruption.
4 days. How did they weaponize the patch so quickly?
By reverse engineering the patch, attackers and security researchers used binary diffing tools to compare the newly patched system files with the original vulnerable versions. By seeing exactly which lines of code Microsoft had changed, they could rapidly pinpoint the location and the precise nature of the vulnerability. That detailed knowledge, derived directly from the patch itself, allowed them to quickly develop a reliable, working exploit for the flaw. This practice is now completely standard procedure in the security world. The moment a patch or detailed vulnerability advisory is released, offensive teams start reverse engineering it to create exploits, often integrating them rapidly into exploitation frameworks like Metasploit for widespread use.
So the defense literally becomes the blueprint for the next attack.
Instantly. It's a fundamental tension with no easy answers.
Wow. We've certainly covered a huge amount of ground today. We went from the unexpected ways our critical infrastructure, like the smart grid, is becoming vulnerable through distributed energy and even consumer gadgets, right through to the incredible sophistication of adaptable, persistent malware like Stuxnet hiding in memory. We dove into the mathematics underpinning our security, why RSA needs such huge keys, and why the efficiency of ECC, with its smaller keys based on elliptic curve math, is driving the security for mobile and IoT. And we saw that even perfect math isn't enough without solid implementation and fundamental principles like least privilege.
Yeah, and I think the overarching lesson from all these sources is that really getting up to speed quickly in this field means you have to go beyond just learning definitions. You need to grasp the fundamental building blocks, the principles of how security works, but also critically how it fails. Whether that failure is a subtle flaw in a cryptographic algorithm's implementation, a misconfigured access control policy, or a human error in handling credentials. And we just ended on that definitive paradox of modern security, didn't we? The MS-05039 example. We saw clearly how the defensive action releasing the patch was immediately weaponized, turned into an offensive tool through reverse engineering. And this really leaves us with a crucial, maybe unsettling question for you to think about. In a world where disclosing the fix instantly provides the blueprint for the next exploit, how can any organization, any vendor, achieve truly comprehensive security? How do you protect your users and systems without simultaneously creating and distributing the very intelligence your adversaries need to succeed? This arms race seems perpetually fueled by the knowledge gained from winning, or even just analyzing the last battle.
It is indeed a perpetual cycle, a fascinating and, frankly, maddeningly complex challenge that makes the work of security professionals both absolutely essential and incredibly difficult. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into the intricate world of modern systemic security.